Welcome to the second half of the lecture regarding the foundations of political theory, Athenian democracy, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. As you'll recall, we last left off with a discussion of Pericles, perhaps the first liberal democrat. Pericles was a hero in the domestic front. Outside the domestic front, however, Pericles was known as an imperialist who prioritized colonizing other areas. Many Athenians in the 5th century BC were concerned with the continuation of the war with the Persians and maintaining cordial relationships with the Spartans. Pericles' strategy was the exact opposite. He wanted to put war with the Persians behind Athens and concentrate on Sparta, which he saw as a threat to the vitality of the Athenian Empire. This brings us to the second major conflict that marked the classical age, the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta. Although Sparta was a partner of Athens in the Delian League and wars against Persia, the peace between the city-states was uneasy. After a series of skirmishes in the early 5th century BC, Athens and Sparta entered into a treaty of non-aggression that was valid for about 30 years. During the early 5th century BC, one might have viewed the relationship between these two city-states as akin to Cold War. Athens and Sparta were similar in several ways. However, as we'll see in the next slide, the differences between the two city-states far outweighed the similarities. Sparta and Athens may have been geographically close and had similar forms of government in name. However, Spartans focused on war and obedience, while Athenians focused on creativity and openness. In Sparta, newborns who were not deemed physically fit were left to die. Young men left their mothers at age 7 to focus on military training, and women focused on warrior sons, even receiving their own physical training in order to raise healthy, strong boys. Citizen women were free to move around, and they enjoyed a great deal of freedom, because in times of war it was the wife who was expected to oversee and protect her husband's property. Spartans were the defenders of Greece. Athenian life, in contrast, focused on being creative. Boys could be soldiers, or they could pursue life in philosophy, history, or arts and sciences. Girls in Athens were restricted to home and family, wives considered properties of their husbands. Although some women held high posts in religious events and as prostitutes and courtesans, by and large, women were confined to the home. Although the Spartan and Athenian governments appeared similar in that they had assemblies of citizens and also authority figures, Sparta's government was an oligarchy. There was no freedom in Sparta. Everyone served the state. Money was not used, for they didn't want anyone to be richer than anyone else. The biggest difference, perhaps, between Athens and Sparta was in their approach to other city-states. Sparta pursued an isolationist policy, keeping to itself and only providing assistance to others when land around them was threatened. The government did not encourage trade with other countries, for they didn't want their people exposed to foreign ideas. Athens always sought to expand its interests, economically through trade, culturally through education, music, and theater, and of course via colonization. During the 5th century, the Spartans grew more and more wary of Athens' growing prosperity and influence, which came close to infringing on Sparta. On the other hand, Spartan isolationism and power were a direct threat to Athens. These problems came to a head during the Peloponnesian Wars of 431 to 404 BC. By the mid-century, there had been several clashes between Athens and Sparta and their allies. Athens not only suffered major defeats early on, but was ravaged by a plague that hit the city in 430 BC. After the death of hero Pericles in 429 BC, other city-states that were members of the Delian League began to rise up and demand to control their own affairs rather than just fattening the coffers of Athens. This fragmentation enabled another political power, Macedonia, to rise up and gain control via military aggression. Under Alexander the Great, Macedonia would eventually become the largest empire in the ancient world during the 4th century BC. One of your readings from this week, the Melian Dialogues by historian Thucydides, concerns the tensions between Athens and another city-state, Melos, during the latter half of the Peloponnesian War. In the Melian Dialogues from 416 BC, Thucydides recreates a fictional account of a real meeting that took place between the Athenians and the Melian Council. Frustrated by the uprisings of so many city-states in the Delian League, Athens attacked the island of Melos. The leaders of Melos then faced a terrible choice: have their countrymen die as freemen or live as slaves. The island was surrounded by the naval fleet of 38 ships carrying heavy infantry, and archers waited on the shores ready for action as the Melians deliberated. The Melians attempted to convince the Athenians to understand the principle of neutrality, that their people were neutral in the Athens and Sparta conflict and had been so for over 700 years. They argued that no nation had the right to attack them without provocation. They did not meet success with their argument. Ultimately, Athens conquered Melos, although the Melians held them off for a short while. According to Thucydides, the victorious Athenians executed every adult Melian man, sold every woman and child into slavery, and colonized the island. The Melian dialogues are known for setting up what is a classical realist theory in international relations. Basically, this is the idea that might makes right. We can contrast this with the ideals of Athenian democracy that were trumpeted within the Athenian city-state. The second major reading assigned for this week is by Pericles, the leader of Athens described in the previous slides. This reading, Pericles' funeral oration, is also by Thucydides. We do not have Pericles' original words, but the oration was taken from an actual elaborate ritual that Pericles participated in to commemorate the loss of all Athenian men who perished during the first year of Peloponnesian Wars. Like all speeches by important public figures, the oration is important not only for what is stated, but what is implied. As we know, vital in Athenian society were concepts of arete, personal individual excellence, and eunomia, good in the order of state and culture. Many of these stood in specific contrast to Spartan ideals of frugality, insularity, and modesty. As you read Pericles' oration, look for the examples he provides of arete and eunomia. Ask how the oration relates to democracy in ancient Greece. In what ways did the death of an individual citizen soldier become an occasion to praise the city of Athens? And given the political status of Athens at the time vis-à-vis other city-states such as Melos, why would this speech have been important? Many think Pericles may not have written this speech himself, interestingly, but his girlfriend Aspasia of Miletus. Aspasia was a popular high-class prostitute and salon hostess in Athens. She was also known for being very, very smart. It's interesting to think that the foundation for one of the greatest speeches in world politics may in fact have been written by a prostitute. Ultimately, Athens and Sparta suffered massive casualties during the conflict. Sparta turned to its original enemy of Persia for help in defeating the Athenians. The end result of the Peloponnesian Wars was that by 404 BC, Sparta had liberated Greece and imposed an oligarchic regime in Athens, called the 30 Tyrants. But that only lasted less than a year. Ultimately, direct democracy was deemed a failure. Macedonia, by the 4th century BC, had, for all intents and purposes, conquered Greece. The social upheaval and wars of the 5th century BC had the positive result of turning Athens into an intellectual and artistic center. The changing times fostered great thinkers who questioned the ways in which human nature and freedom were defined and explained. Repeated conflicts began to weaken citizens' belief in God and the divine. People searched for ways to explain right and wrong with logical explanations for what was going on. Enter political philosophy. In preparation for next week's readings, let's take a very quick look at these beginnings of political philosophy by examining the lives of some key political philosophers in Athens: Socrates, his student Plato, and Plato's student Aristotle. Next week, we'll delve in depth into the ideas of these thinkers. For now, just a little history. The first political philosophers might be called pre-Socratic. They mostly all came from one town called Miletus in the region of Ionia, a hotspot for trading of goods and ideas. Around 600, these thinkers discovered speculation, asking a simple but profound question: what exists? For 200 years, pre-Socratic philosophers worked on developing different rational and non-mythical explanations for natural phenomena. Philosophers from this time who you might recognize include Pythagoras, who introduced mathematical explanations, and Hippocrates, who distinguished magic from medicine. Another important group that arose during this time were the Sophists. Sophists were traveling teachers paid to educate the sons of Athenians. The main skills that were taught were rhetoric and oratory, writing and speaking, skills one needed to participate in public life. The Sophists, origin for the term sophistry, believed above all what was important was the art of persuasion. They didn't teach an absolute truth, but taught their students the art of logical argument. For this, they gained a reputation as being a bit shifty, as speaking in circles. From these beginnings of philosophy emerged thinkers that we'll begin to look at next week. Socrates, who many people regard as the wisest Athenian ever to have lived. Plato, Socrates' student, and Aristotle, a student of Plato's. We will look more in depth at the lives of these philosophers as we begin the Week 3 lecture. And on that note, I leave you. Have a great week, post on the discussion board, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.